Hello and welcome to SLA Spotlight, the podcast of Stuart Leach Associates, the litigation and disputes communication specialists. I'm Malcolm Monroe, a television journalist, and in this series I'll be talking to leaders, thinkers, pioneers in the world of law, business, the arts, media, and much more. Today I'm joined by Lucy Prebble. Lucy, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Lucy Prebble really needs no introduction as a multi-award-winning British playwright and screenwriter and producer. Lucy is known for her compelling storytelling and often explores themes of power, corruption, and the dark side of human nature. Her notable works include the plays Enron, which turned a corporate scandal into a theatrical hit, The Effect, and in television she is the creator of Secret Diary of a Call Girl and co-creator of the dark comedy I Hate Suzie. And she served as executive producer and writer of the acclaimed and much acclaimed HBO and Emmy award-winning series Succession, which has hooked the nation. Lucy, welcome. Can I begin by asking you, before you set out on this amazing career as a writer, I gather that you quite fancied your life as a lawyer, and in fact you actually had applications written out for law school.
I not only had applications written out for law school, I was actually accepted to go to a law school. I made a lot of applications after I left university, where I studied English, to go on and do law. And my plan had been to go. And I had these sort of these forms under my bed that were like an acceptance from one, but also other, potentially other ones I might apply to. And I decided to defer it for a year. And the plan was, such as there was a plan, I was like, firstly, there was a bit of me that didn't want to go straight again into education, having been in education for years and years and years, as you are as a child and then a young adult. And I thought, I'd quite like to do something different. And then, and there was just this bit of me that thought, if I could take a year, and if anything happens in that year that suggests to me that I could possibly have a career in like the arts or entertainment, which was probably like closer to my heart, I suppose, then I'll take that as a message that I should pursue that. But if it doesn't, if nothing happens in that year, then I'll take that as a message from the universe that I should go and do law. And law wasn't like something that was like, law. I was potentially quite excited about being a criminal barrister. That was my dream. And I think now when I look at the stuff I've written, I can see a bit of that in it. Like it's often based on real events and sometimes like real crimes that have happened. And also there is a sort of strident quality to it often in terms of what it's arguing, that you can see a sort of legal feeling or underpinning to it.
Well, with hindsight, you probably made the right decision.
Did you think? I don't know.
But nevertheless, there must have been aspects of law, as you say. There is an element of law which is about writing. It is about theatre in some cases. It is about persuasion. And was that what appealed to you initially?
Yeah. I think particularly in the sort of barrister context, as you say, there's some theatricality to that. But I also think fundamentally it's about storytelling. I mean, what's extraordinary about the justice system is how much of it is about telling a convincing story, which is obviously all the arts is about as well. I mean, it's almost frightening how much it's about telling a convincing story, because if you get enough people on your side in a jury example with that story, then that affects somebody's life. I think of law as sort of like the arts with actual stakes, like people's lives are affected in a way that the arts, you could sort of always go, that one didn't work. No, that one didn't work. Oh, well, we'll try again next time. But in law, if that one doesn't work, somebody's, in or out of prison potentially. So yeah, sometimes, yes, I sometimes do. I have a great admiration for a certain kind of lawyer,
And of course, what we've seen increasingly with the court of public opinion and social media and literally everyone being able to have their say, that the storytelling that you talk about that goes on in a courtroom or in an arbitration is not the only factor. There's also the conversation and the stories that are being told outside the courtroom.
Yeah. And I don't think we've ever lived in an age where there is so much storytelling, for better and for worse. I think you have to look at, you only have to look at the incredible prevalence of conspiracy theorizing now, and the way that living online for a lot of people has made that sort of available to them, and sometimes even more available to them than the outside world or the rest of their reality, you can get really caught inside a story in a way that maybe people didn't so much decades ago, or even, I don't know, centuries ago. But it feels like there's 100 stories for every one real thing that's happened, and in a way, what the law tries to do, and I think if you're a good artist, what you also try and do is find the one true story in the middle of that and try and tell it.
Yes, I mean, you were already established and you had been recognised as a promising playwright before Enron. But Enron, as a major success, was about one of the biggest corporate collapses in history, and not, I would say, an obvious choice for a subject. Why did you choose something like that?
Well, it's funny because I would say that the work I was doing before Enron was less like me than Enron is. So I was offered a lot of work, not a lot of work, but some work as a young up-and-coming sort of writer about women particularly, and young women, and because I was a young woman at the time, and I sort of worked on Secret Diary of a Call Girl, which was, not a particularly good show, but it was a show that got a lot of attention for obvious reasons. And so then I was sort of like, the only things I was offered was in that vein. So Enron actually came out of me going away as a writer and going, what do I actually want to write about? What do I find interesting? And my family background, other than my mum, who's worked like in education most of her life, but a lot of the rest of my family work in business. And I would always been very interested in what that word means and contains, because it's such a weird, amorphous word. And really, it means money. A lot of the time is what it means. And I remember reading about the collapse of Enron when it happened, and it was this huge event. It felt like a company of that size hadn't really completely collapsed for quite a long time. And there was this bubble bursting element to it. And I think it takes us back to what we were just talking about, stories. There were two things that attracted me to it. One was it felt like a story that hadn't been told. And when I went, I studied English, so I read, books and plays as part of my degree. And I felt like business and the corporate world were really assiduously avoided in the arts, almost like writers and artists are going like, oh, I don't understand all of that. I'm not really interested in all of that. I want to write about, love and relationships and death and existentiality. And I remember thinking, but this is so much of our world. Like, our world is run by this, like business, by big business, by finance, by corporations. So there was that element to it that really attracted me, which was like the unrepresentedness of it on stage. And the second thing was that it was a story, Enron. Like, it was itself a story that was sold and then proved to not be true. So that thing of essentially you're dealing with a big con in a way, but then underlying that there's a question of, well, is it a con? Isn't a lot of business essentially telling a story in order to get investment that you then make good on? So the question underneath that of like, well, aren't we living in this precarious sort of con anyway of what some people might call capitalism, but essentially the idea that most companies are built on debt, and Enron just took their debt too far potentially. So it was all of that I just found really fascinating and exciting in terms of telling the story of, without thinking about numbers or men wearing suits, just sat in a room talking about numbers. It was never that to me. It was like, well, what's the big lie? What's the show that's being put on for the market? In this example.
Well, yes, I remember as a journalist at the time, one of the big questions about Enron was, how could it have happened? How did it happen? And I guess that was an intriguing question for you to ask.
Yeah, how did it happen? Absolutely. And who are the characters? Who are the people who contribute to something like that happening? And having done a lot of research on that, I see it all the time now, like these little tropes that you notice, some of them really silly and petty, and some of them sort of quite big and telling. But for example, the small silly ones were like Jeff Skilling, who ran Enron as the CEO for a long time, and particularly when it was going through this bubble period. He was a former nerd. He was really, really very intellectual, very driven by an interest in the technology, the numbers, visionary, but in a very sort of like unpopular, nerdish way. And then he goes through this transformation at a certain point in his life where he gets incredibly fit, incredibly buff, goes to the gym continuously, gets his glasses taken away and gets LASIK so that his appearance is much more traditionally macho and sort of symmetrical and sort of gets his hair replaced and stuff, does all of this stuff. And that sort of happens in line with the timeline of this recreation of the company from this quite old-fashioned but fundamentally profitable energy oil company, really, oil and gas, like things you get from the ground, like with a very easy to understand model. And the company at the same time transforms itself into this much more virtual, based on trading kind of modern company as he's transforming himself. And in that transformation, there comes a sort of grandiosity to him and a certainty that allows the company to really get itself into trouble. And there's an arrogance to the company. It's like the phrase that comes up over and over again when you look into those old Enron transcripts is like, they just don't get it. They just don't get it. That's what they say about people who question the stock price or people who question what Enron's doing. So it's this real intellectual arrogance. And in a way, it was like a 90s and early 2000s precursor to what we see now happening so much across business, but particularly, obviously, the tech industry.
Well, yes. I mean, maybe there's a thread there between Enron and Succession in the sense that in both cases you have these larger-than-life, male, charismatic characters with Logan Roy, played by the wonderful Brian Cox, and as you say, Schilling. And is that one thing that intrigues you, having businesses where there is a leader who is literally larger than life, who has such an impact on the business, just through the strength of their personality and their moral code? Yeah. Is that something that intrigues you?
Yeah, I mean, it's also easy to write about, like in a sort of mercenary way. As a writer, you go, right, oh, if you've got a good character, then you can get a good actor. And if you can get a good actor, then you can make a good show. Nobody really wants to play the dull, smaller than life character. So it works as well, like artistically. But yeah, it is also really fascinating because at what point do you draw the division between a business and a cult? For example, if you've got a very strong charismatic leader who's telling this story and you have all of these followers or employees or shareholders or whatever, whatever group of people you're referring to who have to really literally buy in, you're not a million miles away from a cult setup. And I think we can see that in contemporary terms, even in political parties, in America in particular, at the moment, like the division between the Republican Party and a cult is getting smaller and smaller. And I think, yeah, that obviously those are fascinating people to look at. However, having said that, when I wrote another play, A Very Expensive Poison, I had to characterize Putin in it. I was really, really keen to not make him this very charismatic, larger-than-life character. Because, A, I don't believe that to be true in terms of personality. But B, that's what he wants you to do. He wants to be perceived that way. It's really advantageous for him to be perceived that way, rather than as sort of an ex-pencil pusher from the FSB who kind of got lucky and is now just controlling by terror. And I think sometimes questioning the size of the Great Oz, as it were, to use like the Wizard of Oz example, sometimes looking behind the curtain and questioning whether or not the person is actually what they claim to be is important.
Yes, that's quite a big part, I would say, of the way that you write about the corporate world. Is there is a lot of dark dealings, intrigue, reading between the lines, the note behind the note. Not all is what it seems. And I guess lawyers have to unpick that in legal cases. Do you think your interest in law has helped you write those kind of scenarios, particularly, for example, in Succession, where non-disclosure agreements, other legal threats are dished out on a fairly regular basis? Was it helpful that you had that sort of synergy, if you like, with the legal profession?
Yeah, it's really helpful. It also gives you confidence to write about stuff that you might otherwise avoid because you'd feel a bit intimidated by it. Obviously, I still am sometimes intimidated. Television and theatre are quite different. Theatre, in a weird way, you feel a bit safer when you're writing about tricky subjects because just not as many people come and see theatre. So you're much less likely to get in trouble for it. So you can sometimes say the daring thing because actually, at the end of the day, the person who you might be talking about will probably not necessarily hear about it or see it. Whereas in television and film, people can get really, really litigious, understandably because the potential audience is much larger. So, for example, the thing you always have to, be aware of as a writer who writes about real stuff is is defamation. And what is defamation? How can you if you feel you should be sailing close to that, how do you sail close to that safely? It's with Enron, it was weirdly easy because even though I was writing real characters, a lot of the people I was writing had actually been convicted. So the argument of like, well, you would be damaging their reputation is not really relevant anymore because you're writing about them having done something that they were convicted of doing. So their reputation has been damaged in that regard. And like me writing a play about it is hardly going to, it would be very hard for them to argue that furthered that, right? But obviously, if you're writing about corporate industry, like in Succession or something, where you have potentially a large audience, and these are not people who are criminals necessarily or convicted, they are people who just work and live in the world and have a lot of money and are famously incredibly litigious, then you have to think about it a lot harder.
Of course, you've worked with ITV, you've worked with HBO and other production houses. They will have lawyers, of course.
Mm-hmm.
How closely, when you're writing, particularly when you get to the sort of final cut, are you working with lawyers and relying, if you like, on their advice or guidance?
That does happen. That has happened in my career a number of times where I've sat down and spoken directly with a lawyer. Again, weirdly, it happens more in theatre because you're personally liable in a really specific way. It's really, there's something freeing about theatre, as I said, but also quite scary because it's you that would get sued, essentially. And I remember sitting down with A Very Expensive Poison and having a big conversation with a lawyer about some implications I was making in that. But in television, as you say, there's such a big system that you're part of that absorbs some of that on your behalf. You do sometimes get a note which is this based on something actually real? So we should just check, but that will go through the Department of Legality. Succession, that stuff hardly ever occurred because quite sincerely, by the time that television show was written and made, we had done so much looking and talking about so many different media families, and also, honestly, injecting stuff like from people we knew and our own families, that I really think it would be both legally and just emotionally impossible to say that's that person and that's that person, literally. So that situation felt quite safe.
Yes, and of course, the obvious parallels with the Murdoch family, with a right-wing news network, the children of a charismatic media mogul, the parallels are hard to ignore. And I think it's been loosely acknowledged, but it hasn't created any problems because it is, at the end of the day, a piece of fiction.
Exactly. And honestly, from having worked on it, what we wanted was actually the freedom, weirdly, to draw on as much true stuff as possible, but literally as much true stuff as possible. So that means reading, biographies and accounts of families' mergers, like whether it's the Trumps, whether it's the Redstones, whether it's there are actually, when you look into it, dozens of people with, whether it's the Maxwells, of course, that was a big thing we talked about, the Maxwells and the relationship between those children as well. So we were drawing on actually so much ultimately that it would be impossible really to define it in those clear terms. And also, once you get certain actors playing certain roles in a TV show, because that's going on for so many years, you're also really inspired by the actor themselves. And sometimes those actors actually aren't that similar to people who you might have been picturing or basing something on early on. And you start to become very inspired by how those actors behave and what their own relationships are with each other. So it's sort of, yeah, it obviously we did lots of research, and we never ever wanted to just draw from nothing. Like, we didn't want it to feel like science fiction. We wanted it to feel very, very much grounded in this world and what's happened in this world. But the inspirations were so many by the end that you just wouldn't have been able to legally pin it on anyone, I think.
Yes, I mean, you write a lot about the intrigues and the the amazing shenanigans that go on in the corporate world. But you also said, when you referenced Putin, that you didn't want to make him out to be in some way some charismatic character, not least because he isn't very charismatic in reality.
Yeah.
But do you see actually a sort of moral responsibility when you're writing about things to represent them a bit like a journalist would, as fairly and accurately as you can, in a sort of moral way?
The honest answer to that is yes, I really do. But weirdly, there's something about that I feel embarrassed by. I don't know why. Like, I guess there's some part of me that feels like an artist should sort of not be engaged in a moral purpose, that there's something didactic and sort of thin about that, and that a great artist would just be like responding to the world in a very like emotionally true way and not be trying to convince you of anything while they do it. That's sort of what I feel. But I know that I am doing that. I know I am. I know that when I write, it comes from a place often of anger, actually. And there are probably all sorts of like old psychological reasons for that. But I find anger to be incredibly creative. And I think that sort of anger is also important to express. So yeah, I do. I often start, particularly with my theatre stuff, weirdly, from that place of like, I find something out, or I hear about a story and I look into it, and it creates this feeling in me of like, this story must be told, which I even don't like saying out loud because it also sounds quite arrogant as well. But
Well,
I
yes,
do.
but you haven't shied away from taking controversial subjects, potentially risky subjects, so subjects which the moral perception might be risky. For example, with Secret of a Call Girl, based on the Belle de Jour diaries. Some people didn't like the way that you perceived the world of prostitution.
Yeah.
So you were quite brave there.
I guess in retrospect, I do look at some of my earlier stuff and I go like, oh yeah, I can really see the courage in doing that. I'm not sure I felt it at the time. I think that's more like there's a certain energy to when you're young that maybe looks like courage in retrospect, but is a sort of reckless, like trying, like throwing stuff around. And also I think when you're young, I felt there was so much that was unsaid. Like, for example, I was reading a lot of blogs in that. It was like the era of blogs. If you remember, like the early 2000s, there was like people, it was like you were suddenly able to read everyone's diaries online. And it was this really interesting time as a writer. And I remember reading, this sex worker's diary and going, oh, this world is just totally unknown. The only time you ever see this on television is sort of when maybe someone's the victim of a murder at the beginning of a detective show, or you're watching something, that's meant to be sort of lurid and lascivious. And I thought, what if you did it just from her point of view? It's just quite interesting. But truthfully, that show wasn't very well achieved, so I don't really defend it. Like, I wouldn't watch that show now because it's just way too it's just really light and not very successful in what it's trying to do in my view. But I think that the impetus of like, this is a really interesting world that we sort of haven't properly explored from the woman's point of view. I mean. And I think there was a part of me, that's sort of brave, I suppose, but also a bit stupid, that goes like, well, we should do it then. And actually, in retrospect, it wasn't necessarily the greatest thing.
But clearly, much of your work has been written about very, very serious subjects, where in the stories themselves, the corporate world the media world. For the characters that you write about, the stakes are very high. But you've also written dark comedy. I Hate Suzie with Billy Piper is a dark comedy, and I understand you might be working on something now which has a comedy theme to it. Mm-hmm. Is that another side to your character, the desire to be funny, to amuse?
Yeah, and also I don't think they're unrelated. For me, like political stuff and anger is very related to comedy. I've not met a comedy writer in my life who I don't think is tremendously angry on some level, even if it's very repressed. And I think that's true of most writers, actually, that there's an interesting relationship with anger. So I grew up, I wasn't like a big theatre goer or anything as a kid. I was a comedy kid. I loved listening to radio comedy and, when I was old enough, going to gigs, but also watching sitcoms. It was comedy that was the thing that I did and enjoyed the most as a viewer or as a listener, to the point where I used to use, my dad had an old dictaphone, like a really old, like 80s one that he didn't use anymore for work. And I remember I would record sitcoms off the television onto the dictaphone because we only had a TV in the living room. So I would record just the audio of sitcoms and then I would listen to them in bed off the dictaphone when I was trying to go to sleep, because I found them incredibly comforting. And so I'm sure that like my interest in dialogue and stuff also comes a bit from that. So yeah, comedy is, I think, possibly the hardest thing, because you have to do all the same thing that you have to do in a drama, which is the story has to really, really work. The characters have to really be believable, and it has to be funny. So it's like you sort of have to do it backwards in high heels, as they say, like the Ginger Rogers thing. It's harder, and yet it gets often a lot less respect, which I think is really a shame.
As well as writing plays, screen scripts, you've also been a producer, at a high level with some massive productions. How do you see the relationship between a producer of a series and the writer? Because you've straddled both.
Yeah, and it's quite a complicated thing, because as you'll know, the word producer can sometimes be a bit amorphous as well in the industry. Like sometimes a producer is somebody, like particularly in news and stuff, who's doing everything. I mean, who's doing a massive amount of basically making the whole show happen, essentially. And sometimes there are areas in American television and film, particularly, where producer is like a title that's handed out basically for money, where someone puts money in. This is more in film, where somebody sort of puts money into a film and they get the title producer and they've never even been on set, So it's really this amorphous, unhelpfully amorphous term. When I produce, I'm a very hands-on producer. So what that would include is like you're not just looking at the script and sort of like helping with rewrites to the script, which is something we do a lot on the TV shows I've produced, but also you're doing casting. You're thinking about what roles are going to be played by who. You're involved in locations, potentially, like where is it going to be set, what's it going to look like on camera, choosing who to hire to direct, things like that. So all the things that sort of have to happen for a TV show to happen. And for me, they're really, really interlinked, writing and producing. A lot of writers in my industry, they will write a script and then they'll sort of give it to someone and sell it, and then that'll be it. There's almost like a relay race. Like you do your bit, you pass the baton on, and someone else runs off and does it, and that's your job done. And I just don't work like that, and I've never worked like that. For me, I'm part of the whole process from beginning to end, from writing to casting to filming to editing, which is a huge part of the process that doesn't get talked about a lot, but you can really, really like change something fundamentally in an edit.
Well, I can certainly identify that. When I first went into television from newspapers, someone said to me, what you'll find most frustrating about television is that so many other people will have their finger on buttons that you want to press.
Right.
So do you sometimes think that part of wanting to produce as well as write is a control thing? You want to control?
Completely. I mean, honestly, I think writers by their very nature are controlling people often anyway. I definitely am. I mean, like you literally want to create a whole other world and then have people live in it. It's like, it's very controlling as a thing to do. People think directors are controlling because they want to tell people what to do. But it's like writers take that to a different level. They want to invent the people and tell them what to do. You know, it's massively controlling. So yeah, so it's very hard for me to not produce. I have done that. I have written stuff and not produced it, but not much. And yeah, I'll tell you what it's not. It's not because I think I know how I want everything to be done. It's not that. And I think as you get older and you have a little bit more experience, and maybe this is true of everything, you become much more comfortable with not knowing and going like, oh, I need a really, really good editor to come in and just show me some things here about how this could work and how this could be. Or a really great director or a really great actor to get to open it up and show me something I wasn't expecting, and then I'll get really excited about that. So it's not about having a vision of how it has to be and then trying to pursue that to the end. It's much more like I want that group of people and I want us to all have access to buttons, but I sort of want to be in the group of people as we're doing it, and to have both that company but also learn that, like, I've learned so much more by producing than by anything else, and it's made me a better writer as well, because once you've sat in an edit and you've honestly seen, like, we didn't need that scene at all, like that incredibly long, incredibly expensive scene didn't need to be there, and it's just snipped out by a really good editor, and actually the story carries on completely fine without it. It's just totally mind-blowing. And until you've had those experiences, or another great example of that is to be on set with a really good actor and to go, oh, we didn't need that line at all. Like, it's all in his eyes and it should be in his eyes. And me articulating it as a writer feels really just like irrelevant. Let him act, let him do it. And so you learn much more about being a good writer from being with other artists as a producer.
But when you work, on a mega series, which I would call Succession, for a mega production company, which is HBO, do you, an American as well, do you inevitably get less control just by the sheer scale and size of the production?
No, I'm trying to answer that honestly. Do you get less control with a big production? I'll tell you why I don't think that's true for Succession. It's that show happened at a really specific period industry-wise, which I would describe as like the end of a golden age or the end of a bubble financially, whichever way you want to put it. And so we sort of got out just at the right time, I think. And that period had involved in it this idea that a showrunner, i.e. the person who's creatively the writer, and in this case Jesse Armstrong, but with a team around him, including myself, but that they kind of know what they're doing and they're in charge of the show as a sort of like CEO of the show, creatively speaking. And that was really enshrined in that period, particularly at HBO. So it's like, so we were at HBO, who were the best network for that, at the best time for doing that, i.e. having the most like literal support financially and professionally for making a show. And so the control came from the right place. It didn't come from somebody like arguing about the budget or, something, or someone who'd run the channel. So I would say that no, it in that case it didn't, but on lots of occasions it does. On lots of occasions it does reduce your level of control. Obviously, if you want complete control, do a one-man show in the theatre, or a one-woman show in the theatre. Then there's absolutely nothing that you're not in control of.
Would you consider that?
No. I really don't like that feeling of being exposed as a performer. As a writer, I sort of want you to hear what I have to say, but I don't want to be there when I'm doing it. it's like lots of control and lots of cowardice. Whereas I really admire actors and performers who will actually go and do it.
So bringing the whole thing back to where we began, really, which is this world of the corporate world of intrigue, of plotting, of players, being less than transparent in some cases, and using, if you like, where appropriate, legal levers to get what they want, which brings us all to the sort of back to your original career plans.
Yeah.
Having looked under the bonnet, which you've had to do to write these productions, about the corporate world or about the media world, have you learned anything about the way that business operates that perhaps is almost unique because of your own experience?
I suppose I'm one of these people who thinks a lot about systems and how they incentivize people, which is maybe not the most like exciting version or answer. I do think that big characters have a huge impact. I do think that, like, you know, the great men philosophy of history or the great women philosophy of history, where people turn up and they have a huge impact, that is real. That is true. But I think that gets overrepresented in art. And I think what's underrepresented in art, because it's really hard to dramatize, is that people do basically go along with incentivized situations, and they tend to also do what everyone else is doing. And that's quite human, even when there are terrible examples of that, when that's taken to an extreme. So I would say that, I guess what I've looked at in business, you can use like Enron just as an example of this, is that, you know, people want to be proud of where they're working. They want to be told a certain story. They will, you know, that they will go along with things that don't seem to be hurting anybody, and until a point where it gets challenged, normally from the outside, and normally, interestingly, by people who are very inexperienced. So in the case of Enron, it was a woman called Bethany McLean, who was a very young Forbes journalist. And the reason that she was able to expose the sort of like grand fraud at the centre of Enron was because she was able to ask very innocent, not innocent exactly, but almost what were perceived as foolish questions. Like, well, you don't ask someone that basic. You don't ask something that basic to the CEO of Enron. Like, how does this work? But because she wasn't very experienced and she wasn't in the inner circle, she did. And it was through asking some of those questions and things being published in Forbes that she wrote that the ground really started to shake underneath Enron, and people started to withdraw money and people started to ask those questions. So I would say, like, the way that systems are set up and who and what they incentivize has such a big impact on how people live their lives. And we just have to take responsibility for that and not be like, well, hopefully people just won't do bad things. Because truthfully, most people will if they're incentivized to do it, and also if everyone else is doing it. So to take some responsibility in that and how you build systems.
That's a really interesting insight. You know, the innocent question, why isn't the king wearing any clothes?
It's exactly that.
Let's finish off this fantastic conversation with a little bit about, if someone was to do what you've done and to write your life story, what would be that story so far?
Oh, what would be my... yeah, I mean, that's really hard from the inside to... because the way we tell our stories is so revealing about who we think we are, isn't it? I mean, I guess I like the story about myself that is, I started off as an assistant. You know, I started off doing secretarial work, you know, in the bowels of theatres, and I read scripts on the quiet, and then I started to try and write my own. And like, there's a story in that. There's a story of, and now I'm, you know, somebody who writes stuff and it gets put on at those theatres. That's a nice story. We all know what that story is. But it is a story. And everything is sort of created like that in your own head. The reason I like it is because it has that nice arc, and it suggests that once I didn't have opportunity and then I made my own opportunity in some way. Is that really true? It's much more complicated than that. So I think there are like 10, 20, 30 different stories you could tell, depending on what you choose to focus on. And that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and yet you don't seem to have been, this is just my first time I've met you, but you don't seem to have been touched by the remarkable, almost exponential success you've had as a writer and a producer.
I feel very grateful for it. Genuinely, I do. I feel like I'm finally at a point, and what actually feels really nice is I feel like I'm really close to understanding how stuff works on a holistic level. Like, we're talking about producing, like, oh, I see, like, this is how it works from a script point of view. This is how it works on set. This is how it works in the edit. Like, there's something about being able to see the whole picture that, as a writer and just as a person, I really love. And I feel like I've got closer to that. Still not there completely, because you never, ever, ever know everything, do you? Like, it's impossible. You shouldn't ever think you do. But I feel so much more like I understand it now, and I feel really like excited about that going forward.
Well, of course, the story, we hope, isn't over yet. What's next?
Well, I had a baby 18 months ago, so I've been taking some time off, and I'm now ready to go back. So I was working on a film called Mountainhead, which is out on HBO, which Jesse Armstrong wrote and I exec produced again. That's about 4 tech billionaires who get together for a poker weekend and things go very wrong. So that's very much about like corporate world again. But the next thing I write, I really want to be my own, and I'm having quiet conversations with Billy Piper about possibly reapproaching Suzie, but we will see about that. And other than that, I have a couple of play ideas and a couple of television ideas. So it's exciting, yeah.
Yes, I read something in the media, which I assume is true, of course, that the joys of motherhood were quite challenging.
Yeah. If you're somebody who likes to see the whole picture and likes control, it's challenging. It's very challenging. So but yeah, it's also very beautiful, and I again feel very, very grateful for that. And it just gives you this whole other insight into human beings and love and the world. And I used to have a very cold eye. I used to be able to look at things in a very like analytical, political way. And I am now just in that cliched position of like, everything just breaks me. It just breaks me. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm crying over that news item. I'm sobbing over the fact that my toddler has said this word. Like it's also, it's emotionally really huge and lovely.
And the industry that you're now going to immerse yourself in again, how do you feel about that? Because what we're seeing, you talk about the golden age of of a lot of content-driven, high production value productions, and we're now entering a period where artificial intelligence, AI, is challenging the whole world of creativity and the whole world of the human hand on generating content. Does that concern you at all?
Look, it does concern me. I'd be lying if I said it didn't. I know that networks and large streamers and stuff are experimenting with this stuff at quite a high level, are using it to do certain things. I think, again, they are incentivized to just simply create as much with as little cost as possible. So it's very much in their wheelhouse to do that. As a writer, I feel on a personal level a bit scared about my profession becoming much less relevant or even potentially destroyed. But there is another thing that I feel, and I do think this is true, which is I think that if you were to sort of roboticize, let's say, script writing, which you can do really easily now if you want to, you can put into an AI, like write a script in the style of Lucy Prebble, Jesse Armstrong, whoever, and on this subject, and it will spew one out. And I did this when we were doing Mountainhead, and like said, just see what it does. And mostly it was quite poor quality, but there was this one section in it I got to, I was like, we've made that joke. We've made that bloody joke in the film, and it's in the AI's creation of it. And it was that one line that was like, oh, okay, I am actually frightened, because potentially it's just going to get better and better and better. So, but what I actually believe is that I think audiences will automatically devalue AI content in their souls, like by watching it. By which I mean, if Rodin's Kiss, the sculpture that we're all familiar with, if that had been sort of like created by a machine that had carved it out in front of you from a picture, your experience of seeing Rodin's The Kiss is fundamentally different from knowing that it was sculpted by Rodin. Like, your experience of that piece of art, even if it's exactly the same thing, made of the same thing, and feels and looks exactly the same, your emotional response to it is different because one was machine carved and one was carved by hand. You actually value the machine carved one less. So your artistic experience has changed, even though it's the same product. So even if the AI had been able to create the script of, let's say, Mountainhead, word for word, what we ended up writing, it's the audience's experience that is altered because they're not in communication with another human being, even if that human being is just, not there at that moment, but they made it. And I think ultimately what's going to happen if that continues is that people will just become less and less interested in art. Now, that is a scary prospect for lots of other reasons, but what it is not is profit making. So the fewer people who are enjoying or interested in art, the fewer people will actually continue watching the streamers, and the more their actual business model will collapse. And that, I think, is weirdly hopeful as well as a bit hopeless.
So there'll always be, I hope, a demand for authenticity, and there will also be a space in this brave new world for Lucy Prebble.
Oh, well, I can only hope. I mean, let's hope. Let's hope.
Lucy Prebble, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.